Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this class, we're going to be looking at how to sew and construct an unlined wool coat. This coat is made from a splittable double-faced wool fabric, which is why it doesn't require a lining. Now this is class 3 in a 3-part series, where I showed you firstly how to work with this particular material, then how to draft an unlined wool coat, and finally we're going to look at how to sew or construct the coat. You will need to start by taking your material and cutting out your pattern. If your material has a nap, then you will need to follow a nap layout. I have a video on nap which I'll put a link to here. Then you'll want to mark any details from your pattern onto the fabric. This would be notches, as well as the roll line, the pocket placement, and the belt loop placement. You can mark them using tailor's tacks and thread tracing, or some chalk. If you're working with a double-faced splittable wool fabric, you will need to complete a basting stitch in some locations. Now you can complete the basting stitch around the entire pattern piece, or you can simply follow this list to complete the basting stitch where it's required. I will also discuss this on my corresponding blog post. I would recommend re-watching class 1 to ensure that you're up to date with the sewing techniques for working with a double-faced splittable wool fabric, as I will be speeding through the sewing and focusing on the construction in this class. Grab your cutout pieces and we can begin. In order to assemble the front pieces of the coat, we're going to need to prepare the pockets and then sew them on. Now I have got my pocket pattern piece in front of me here, and you can clearly see that I have completed a basting stitch all of the way around. I have also separated the layers of material up to the basting stitch all of the way around. You need to complete a guide stitch on what will be the front separated seam allowance of the pocket, starting across what will be the top edge of the pocket and then completing that guide stitch all the way around. Now for the back of the pocket, you only need to complete a guide stitch on the separated seam allowance at the top edge. You don't need to complete this the rest of the way around the pocket because we will be sewing the pocket onto the coat. In order to prepare our pocket for hand sewing later on, we can trim the seam allowances that we've completed the guide stitch onto now. You'll simply want to remove approximately 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters, depending slightly on the thickness of your material. Of course, you only want to do this on the edges where you have completed the guide stitch. Position your front with the right side of the material facing up. Take your pocket pattern and position that onto the front pattern with the right side of the pocket facing up. Align the pocket pattern with the markings that you've made on the front of the garment. For the top edge of the pocket, you should be aligning the guide stitch with the horizontal marking for the top of the pocket on the front of the garment. Turn the seam allowances along the top edge of the pocket under to align the guide stitch. If you already have completed a pocket on the side, you're going to want to double check that the pockets are placed symmetrically. Pin or baste the pocket in place, along the top edge like you can see here, as well as down the side and bottom edges of the pocket. We are going to be sewing the bottom separated seam allowance onto the coat front, around the 3 sides of the pocket, not the top edge. You may wish to draw your stitching line onto the seam allowances in chalk. Alternatively, you can use your markings on your sewing machine or do what I'm doing here, which is to align my pin placement with my stitching line. You will see me double check these measurements with a ruler at the sewing machine. Now the important thing here is that at the start and at the end of the pocket, you need to make sure that that top edge of the pocket is folded under. It should be folded under with the top edge folded along the guide stitch. Complete a decent back stitch, 3 to 4 stitches at the start and at the end of sewing the pocket for security. When you begin sewing, it can be a good idea to hold on to the threads or do whatever you need to do with your sewing machine to ensure that you will have a tidy underneath to your stitching, because the stitching will be visible on the wrong side of your garment. Start at one of the corners. Sew down around the bottom of the pocket and back up the other side, sewing on your stitching line using the standard stitch length. When you get to the corner, place the needle in, raise the presser foot and turn your work. At the end of the pocket, make sure that top edge of the separated pocket seam allowance is folded under again. So now you have your sewn pocket, and it should be looking something like this from the front and like this from the back. It's easy to double check here that the stitching line for the pocket is aligned with the thread tracing on the front of the garment. If this is your second pocket, it's a good idea to check that it's symmetrical to the first at this point. Then you can press the sewn seam allowance towards the pocket, and you can trim this seam allowance down as required. Then we can move on to some hand sewing to finish the pocket. Along the top edge, you will need to fold both of the seam allowances into the middle, aligning the guide stitches along the edge of the fold. You will sew these two edges together along the top edge of the pocket using a ladder stitch. When you get to the corner, you're then going to need to change into a slip stitch. To get a neat corner, it can be a good idea to fold the seam allowances in opposite ways. So on the one side, for the top edge of this pocket, I will fold under the top edge of the pocket first and then the side edge of the pocket. For the other layer of the seam allowance, I will fold under the side edge of the pocket and then the top edge of the pocket. This can help to minimize the bulk slightly. You will also need to have a few more stitches around the corner, keeping them closer together. Complete the slip stitch around the rest of the pocket. You will sew into the front of the garment, just beyond the seam, attaching the pocket onto the garment front, and then into the pocket, onto that top separated seam allowance where you have your guide stitch. Once the pocket hand stitching is complete, you can remove the basting stitch on the pocket and any of the thread tracing to mark the pocket placement on the coat front. To finalise the pocket, we're going to sew a bar tack onto both of the pocket corners. This will help to provide a little bit more strength and reinforcement along the pocket opening. You're going to want to sew this bar tack a distance of 1/4 inch or 5mm in from the edge of the pocket. You will start sewing at the very top edge and sew for a distance of 1/4 inch to 3/8, 5mm to 1 centimetre. I'm going to complete this with my normal stitch length. You need to sew this forwards and backwards 2 to 3 times. And here you go. Here is your finished pocket. You can give this a final press, and of course you will need to complete 2 pockets for your garment. In order to assemble the sleeve, you're going to need to sew the 1 or perhaps 2 darts that you have on the sleeve. Now I have a dart at the shoulder and also at the elbow. This is the back of my sleeve and this is the front of this sleeve. I have the right side of my sleeve facing up. You will need to complete a basting stitch along one side of the dart, and it needs to be 1/2 inch away from the edge of the fabric, 1/4 inch or 5mm away from the stitching line of the dart. The basting stitch should be on the side of the dart that you're going to press the dart seam allowances towards. For the shoulder dart in this pattern, I'm going to add my basting stitch to the back of the dart. For the elbow dart, my basting stitch will be closest to the hem. The dart will be pressed towards the hem. The basting stitch should extend the dart point by approximately 2 centimetres, 3/4 inch. Unpick the layers of material up to the basting stitch, just like you've done for any other seams. It's usually a good idea to have the stitching line for the dart marked on the wrong side of your material. You will need to separate the 2 layers of material past the point of the dart. I usually find that I need to cut into the point of the dart. You want to only do this on what will be the wrong side of the separated material. Clip towards the point and then continue separating the layers of fabric. You need to be able to release enough material to be able to complete your guide stitch. If your dart is a little bit narrower, like my dart, then you will find that you need to cut through a greater area of the dart. You will be cutting through to the point of the dart, but you need to make sure that you're only doing this on what is the wrong side of the material, separating the layers of material as you work. The guide stitch will take place on what is the wrong side of the separated seam allowance, along the stitching line. And you will complete this from the wide end of the dart to the point, ideally sewing on the stitching line of the point as much as you can. It doesn't matter if you're a little bit off at the point of the dart. Once the guide stitch is complete, we're going to be able to move on to sewing the dart. Place the material with the right sides together and pin the one side of the dart that has not had the seam allowance separated to the top layer of the separated seam allowance on the other side of the dart. You will want to pin along the drawn stitching line. you need to be able to sew along the stitching line all the way to the point of the dart and to not catch that separated lower seam allowance. You may find that you need to clip into the bottom layer of the separated seam allowance right at the point of the dart in order to release this. Join me at the sewing machine to complete the dart as you normally would. Start at the top legs of the dart and sew towards the point. You will backstitch at the beginning, and then when you get to the end, you will sew off the point of the dart and also backstitch to secure. For the elbow dart, you want to start sewing the dart in line with the basting stitch. This keeps the underarm seam of the sleeve available for sewing the side seam of the garment. The dart at the shoulder can be sewn into the neck seam. Press the seam allowances of the dart towards the basting stitch. Use a pressing ham if needed. Then you can work to trim down the seam allowances belonging to the dart seam that you've just sewn, as well as the separate seam allowance with the guide stitch. Once ready, we can then complete a slip stitch by hand to fasten the inside material of the dart. You're going to want to work from the large open end of the dart towards the point. This stitch is exactly the same as the technique that you will use for other elements of the garment. The only difference here is when you get to the point of the dart. In order to ensure a neat finish on the wrong side of the material, you will find that you need to complete a few smaller stitches closer together to make sure that the point of the dart is really neatly and securely finished. Here you have the finished dart sewn in the sleeve for both the shoulder seam from the right side and then the wrong side, as well as the elbow dart. And as you can see here, the dart at the elbow has not been sewn past the basting stitch. Now we're going to sew the centre back seam of the coat and the kick pleat. I've got the back pieces in front of me with the right side of the material facing up, the left back and the right back. Now the left back needs to have the basting stitch complete and the centre back seam allowances separated up to the basting stitch all the way from the neck to the hem. On the seam allowance that belongs to the wrong side of the left back, you will need to complete your guide stitch. The right back does not need to have the layers of the seam allowance separated from the neck down to the top of the kick pleat. Once you get to the angle and the long line of the kick pleat, you will need to separate the two layers of material up to the basting stitch. For the long line of the kick pleat, you will need to complete your guide stitch on both sides of the separated fabric. For the diagonal top edge of the kick pleat, you only need to complete the guide stitch on what will be the wrong side of the garment. To sew the centre back seam, you're going to place the right sides of the material together. Starting at the neck, you're going to take the right back and you're going to match the edge of the right back to the top layer of the separated seam allowance of the left back, working from the neck down to the top of the kick pleat. At the sewing machine, you will sew from the neck all the way along this seam, joining the right and the left back together, making sure that you keep that bottom separated seam allowance of the left back out of the way. Complete a decent back stitch when you finish sewing. Once you've sewn the centre back seam to the top of the kick pleat, you're then going to take your work and we're going to complete a guide stitch on what is the front separated seam allowance of the left back. You've already got a guide stitch on the back seam allowance. We need to have one on the front here, and we're going to sew this from the hem up to the centre back seam that you just sewed with the kick pleat. This is because below the kick pleat, we're going to need to be finishing the edge of the left back material. Press the seam from the neck to the top of the kick pleat in the direction of the left back. Trim the seam allowances on both sides, the sewn side as well as the guide stitch side. You can also work to trim the seam allowances in the lower part of the left back. Work to finish the left back using hand stitches. Start at the kick pleat and work towards the hem, finishing the edge of the left back using a ladder stitch. Continue sewing down the entire length of this seam, stopping at the corner to the hem. I recommend that you leave the hem and finish this in one go once the side seams have been sewn. Then you can work from the neck down towards the kick pleat, finishing the inside of the left back using a slip stitch. I recommend that you stop hand sewing about 4 inches, 10 centimeters away from the top of the kick pleat. We can then work to sew the kick pleat prior to finishing this area. Make sure that your pleat is folding over on your material correctly. You should have the same amount of extension from your right back pleat at the top and at the bottom. And then you want to fold the inside seam allowance of the top of the pleat angle back and pin the bottom seam allowance into your left back. You will be sewing the kick pleat from this corner along your stitching line, mine's 1/4 of an inch, all the way to 1/4 of an inch away from the edge or your stitching line, as we will be folding in these edges to finish. I will use a slightly longer stitch length up the machine. I'm aiming for about 3 to 3.5 millimeters, and I will complete a small back stitch at the start and at the end to anchor this in place. The top of the kick pleat is now sewn in position, and it looks like this from the wrong side and this from the right side of the garment. Now we can finish by hand sewing the remaining area of the kick pleat. You can start by trimming the areas that you're yet to trim. This will be the angled seam that you've sewn, attaching the kick pleats to the left back, as well as next to the guide stitch on the angled part of the kick pleat, and trimming both layers next to the guide stitch on the straight edge of the kick pleat. Press the sewn seam allowances towards the top of the kick pleat. In order to finish this area by hand sewing, you're going to need to cut into the corner where the centre back seam joins the top angle of the kick pleat. You should be cutting through both layers of the right back separated seam allowance, on an angle cutting to the corner of the stitching. This will release the seam allowances and allow you to finish the angled edge of the kick pleat. You can now work to finish the inside of the kick pleat by hand sewing. Pick up where you previously stopped sewing your slip stitch above your kick pleat. You will now want to continue that stitch, sewing that left back seam allowance onto the top of the centre back seam, all the way down to the kick pleat. Then you can work completing the same slip stitch method across the top of the kick pleat. Make sure that you leave enough space at the start of this seam to allow you to finish the edge of the kick pleats shortly. And finally, you can finish the edge of the kick pleats, sewing down from the kick pleat to the hem and stopping, just like with the left back, before the hem, so that you can finish the hem as one piece later on. Once you've finished hand sewing the long edge of the kick pleat, it can be a good idea to put a few extra slip stitches around this corner. And here you have it, the inside of the finished kick pleat and the right side. Now we can work to assemble the collar unit for the coat. You have two pattern pieces. One is the collar and the other is the collar band. As you can see, both of these pieces have had the basting stitch completed already. The bottom edge of the collar that will join to the collar band doesn't require a basting stitch unless you find it easier to complete it all the way around. To prepare them, you will need to separate the seam allowances on the collar along both the side edges and the outside edge. You do not need to separate the seam allowances on the seam that will join to the collar band. The collar band, though, will need to have the seam allowances separated all of the way around. As you're separating the seam allowances, make sure that you keep any of the markings that you applied to these pattern pieces. You can clearly see my tailor's tacks here. To prepare the construction of the collar to the collar band, you will need to complete a guide stitch on the separated seam allowance for what will be the wrong side of the collar band. The guide stitch will be sewn along the stitching line like you've done for many other seams. Take the two layers of material, the collar and the collar band, and place them one on top of the other with the right sides facing. You will be matching the entire collar seam to what will be the top edge of the collar band, separated seam allowance. I recommend that you match the start, then the end, and perhaps the centre back of the seam, easing any discrepancy between those areas. At the sewing machine, you're going to be sewing this following your normal seam allowance, but you must start and stop stitching in line with the basting stitch. This is because we need to have the seam allowances free along the neck edge to attach to the body of the garment. Once sewn, you will press the seam allowances towards the collar band, trim them, and trim the other side of the seam allowance with the guide stitch. You can then complete the hand-sewn slip stitch on what will be the wrong side of the collar to finish this. When hand sewing, make sure that you start and stop in line with the basting stitch and don't continue into the seam allowances beyond this. Once the seam between the collar and the collar band has been sewn, you can steam the collar to provide some shaping around the neckline. Position the collar around a ham or a rolled up towel with the roll line or the seam between the collar and the collar band, sitting along the edge of the collar. Pin the collar in position and use the steam from your iron to provide some shaping. Once you've steamed this a reasonable amount, you'll want to leave the collar to cool before removing it from the ham or towel. Now that we have all of the individual components ready, we can start assembling the coat itself. Let's begin with the back pattern piece that you've already sewn and constructed at the centre back. You should have a basting stitch continuing along the back raglan seam, and you're going to need to separate the material up to this basting stitch. You will then need to complete a guide stitch on what will be the wrong side of your back, along the raglan seam line. You can then take your sleeve where you will have completed your darts, and you're going to place the sleeve with the right side of the material onto the right side of your back. You will be matching the entire sleeve to what will be the top layer of the separated back seam allowance, aligning the neck and the underarm along the raglan seam. You will then complete the same seam sewing technique. Make sure that you've matched up your stitching line at the neck edge. There may be a little bit discrepancy because of the seam allowances here. You can start sewing at the neck edge, but need to stop in line with the basting stitch at the underarm. When sewing, ensure that you keep that bottom edge of the back seam allowance out of the way. This can be a little bit tricky around the underarm corner. On completion, you will then press the seam allowances towards the back, trim the seam allowances of the sewn seam and of the separated seam allowance with the guide stitch, and complete your hand sewn slip stitch to secure this in place. Just like with the machine sewing, the hand stitching could start at the neck edge but needs to stop in line with the basting stitch at the underarm. You can then complete the same technique attaching the front to the raglan seam. The front raglan seam has had the basting stitch complete and the 2 layers of material separated up to the basting stitch. I've also completed a guide stitch on what will be the wrong side of the separated seam allowance. Position the sleeve and the front with the right sides together. You will then take the entire raglan sleeve seam and pin this to the front separated seam allowance of the front raglan. Take this to the sewing machine and sew from the neck edge all the way down to the underarm seam. For this seam, you can sew all the way through. You do not need to stop in line with the basting stitch, keeping that back separated seam allowance out of the way. Once complete, press the seam towards the front of the garment. As with the other seams, you will need to trim down both the seam that you've sewn as well as where your guide stitch is. Finally, you can hand sew this seam closed on what is the inside of the garment, sewing all the way from the underarm through to the neck edge. Once you've sewn the raglan sleeve at the front and the back, we can then work to sew the side seam. Of course, you'll also need to complete this on the second side of the garment. For the side seam, you need to have a basting stitch completed and the 2 layers of material separated up to the basting stitch on the back of the garment. So the underarm seam for the back of the sleeve and the side seam for the back of the garment. If you have completed a basting stitch on the front of the garment, that's no problem, you just don't need to separate the material. A guide stitch needs to be completed on what will be the wrong side of the back separated seam allowance for both the side seam and the underarm seam. And this is why it was important that we didn't sew all the way through to the edge of the material on the back raglan seam. The same applies to that back elbow dart in the sleeve if you have one. If you're sewing your guide stitch after sewing your raglan seam or your elbow dart, you're going to want to make sure that the guide stitch holds those already sewn seams correctly, because you will have stopped sewing these seams in line with the basting stitch. It can be useful to hand sew the seams, such as the raglan seam and the elbow dart, beyond the basting stitch in the separated seam allowance. This will hold it in place whilst you do the guide stitch. As with all the other seams, you will position the garment with the right sides of the material together, so the right side of the front onto the right side of the back, the right sleeves facing one another. Align the hem of the sleeve, elbow dart of the sleeve to a notch marking on the front underarm seam, the underarm seam of the raglan between the front and the back, and the hem of the garment. You are aligning the front of the garment and the front of the sleeve with the top separated seam allowance of the back of the garment or the back of the sleeve. At the sewing machine, you're going to want to start sewing at either the hem of the sleeve or the hem of the garment. Start and stop sewing in line with the basting stitch so that the hems can be finished at a later stage. It's really important at the underarm seam join that you have the two raglan seams directly on top of one another. You may like to baste this in position prior to taking it to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, you're of course going to be following the seam allowance that you've worked with on the rest of the garment. You want to start with the back stitch and end the seam with the back stitch, keeping that other layer of your separated seam allowance out of the way, whether that layer's on the top or on the bottom. The side seam will need to have the seam allowances pressed towards the back of the garment, all the way from the hem, up the side seam and through into the sleeve. Use a seam roll and position it inside the sleeve to make the pressing easier. Then, just like with all the other methods, you will need to trim down the seam that you've sewn and the separated seam allowance with the guide stitch. And then you can work to hand sew the entire length of this seam, all the way from the hem of the sleeve, through the underarm and the raglan seam join, to the hem of the garment, starting and stopping in line with the basting stitches at both hems. You will of course need to complete the raglan seams and this side seam for both sides of the garment. Join me back here when you've done that. The next step is going to be to finish the hems of the garment, both the sleeve hem as well as the garment hem. All of the hems will be finished in the same way. A basting stitch will be applied and the fabric layers will be separated up to the basting stitch. Prior to doing the guide stitch, it can be a good idea to hand sew the individual separated seam allowances where you have a seam from the basting stitch up to the edge of the fabric. The guide stitch will be completed on both sides of the separated seam allowance. Trim the seam allowances as required, and then work to tuck the two separated layers into the middle to hand stitch with your ladder stitch, picking up the material just outside of the guide stitch so that it's invisible. Work the entire way around the circle of the sleeve hem, and from the garment hem, this will be from the back kick pleat to the front edge. Over these joins, you may find that you need to add a few more stitches a little bit closer together, just to ensure a neat finish over the bulkier area. The same applies for any corners, and just like we've discussed previously, it can be useful to fold the seam allowances on the corners in opposite directions. And now we have two finished sleeve hems, and I've removed the basting stitch on this hem and given it a press so you can see the finished result, as well as a finished garment hem from the front through to the back of the garment on both sides. I've also started finishing the front edge along one side. We now need to prepare the garment for the collar installation. You should have both front edges of the garment with the two layers of the material separated up to the basting stitch, as well as a guide stitch completed on both sides. This guide stitch needs to continue around the top corner of the lapel up to the notch where the collar will end. The two layers of material are separated up to this notch and there is a guide stitch completed on both sides. You do not need to have a basting stitch or separate the seam allowances around the neckline beyond this notch. I have completed this on both sides. You can also see that I've started to hand sew the front edge on the one side. Now onto the collar. You're going to need to have the two layers of material separated up to the basting stitch all the way around the entire collar piece, both the collar and the collar band. You should have stopped sewing the seam between the collar and the collar band at the basting stitch, so you will need to finish these areas by hand to ensure that you have a neat stitch at the sewing machine. Find the notch that will be the last notch that connects to the neck of the garment. From this notch around the outside edge of the collar, you're going to want to complete a guide stitch on both sides of the separated collar seam allowance. This is because this area of the collar will be finished by hand and will not attach to anything. For the neck edge of the collar that's going to attach to the garment, you should still have the two layers of fabric separated up to the basting stitch, but you only need to have a guide stitch on the back of the collar, going from the notch, the last notch that's going to attach to the garment neckline, all the way through to this same notch on the other side. You can also clearly see all of the notch markings on my collar. Once you've prepared your collar and your garment, you can work to assemble them. Take the collar and work to match the notches all the way around the collar onto the neckline of the garment. You should be matching the front separated seam allowance of the collar with both layers of the neck material of the garment. If you want to add a hanging loop to your garment, then I recommend that you sew this in whilst sewing the collar onto the neck seam. I forgot to add mine at this point and had to unpick my seam to add it in later. If you want to add a hanging loop, whether it's in your self fabric, like mine is, a ribbon or a gros grain, or some loops that you can attach a metal hanging loop onto, I recommend that you do that now. To create a hanging loop, I'm going to separate the two layers of my material and cut a piece that measures 10 centimeters, 4 inches by approximately 3 centimeters, approximately 1.25 inches. Make sure that you choose to work with what is the front layer of your material. Fold the piece in half, matching the long edges together. At the sewing machine, you're going to be sewing this using your 5mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. This will leave you with a hanging loop that's approximately 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter in width. Of course, you can choose to make a narrower loop, but it may depend on the thickness of your material. Trim your seam allowance and turn the loop around to the right side. Press the loop flat so that the seam is sitting in the middle of the wrong side. Place the loop in position on the neck seam of the garment. The short edges on either end of the piece of fabric will sit within the neck seam, aligning with the seam allowances of the collar band and the neck of the back of the garment. I centered my hanging loop on the back raglan seam. If you're working with a natural fiber like a wool, you will also be able to steam shape this using your iron to create more of a curved shape like you see here. The hanging loop simply needs to be sewn onto the garment when you sew the neck band. I would recommend that you tack this in place, and you can do this when you baste or tack your collar into position along the neck edge. So I have my collar basted or tacked onto the neckline of my garment. I have attached what will be the front separated seam allowance of my collar to the neck edge of the garment, aligning all of my notches. Before you head to the sewing machine, it can be a good idea to double check the size of your lapel and to check that the front edge of the collar is symmetrical on both sides. To do this, I usually align the very front edge of my lapel. You should be aligning your stitching line here, or the finished edge if you've already hand sewn this, matching along to that first notch where you're going to start and stop sewing the collar. You want to double check that the distance from the very front edge of the lapel to not only the notch for the collar, but the actual stitching line for the collar, so the guide stitch, is exactly the same length on both sides. You can also check the length from the outside edge of the collar to the neckline. If you have any discrepancy, I would recommend repositioning the collar prior to taking it to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, you're going to want to start sewing on the notch where the neckline joins the collar. This should be in line with the guide stitch for the collar, exactly 1/4 inch, 5mm in from the edge, because this edge of the collar will be finished by hand afterwards. You will start sewing here, secure with a back stitch, and sew all the way around the neckline for the collar, finishing at the exact same point on the other side. I'm marking my starting and my ending with a pin. You can use chalk if you prefer. When sewing the neck seam, it's a good idea to sew over the short edges of the hanging loop a couple of times to provide increased strength and security. It can be a nice idea to sew the neck seam first and then return to sew over the hanging loop. At the sewing machine, you're going to want to begin by positioning your needle at the precise point that you need to start sewing your collar. It's really important that you get this right and symmetrical on both sides. I'm going to start with a small back stitch to secure my work, and then I'm going to work to sew the collar onto the neckline. I'm sewing through one of the separated collar seam allowances and both of the neckline seam allowances that haven't been separated. You're going to want to work to follow your stitching line. Mine is 1/4 inch, 5mm. And I'm going to need to manipulate my work, sewing around the curve of the neckline. Eventually, you will get back to the second side of the collar where you need to make sure that you stop exactly on the point that you've marked. Again, I would complete a small back stitch. Once you've sewn the collar and the neckline seam, it's a good idea to check for any puckers or pleats. If you have any issues, unfasten that area and re-sew it now. It's also good to double check your collar placement again. Match the front lapels and check that the distance from the front of the lapel to the collar join is symmetrical on both sides, as well as the neckline edge to the end of the collar. If you're happy, we can then proceed. I'm going to firstly work to remove my tailor's tacks so that they're out of the way. And then I'm going to press the neckline seam allowances towards the collar, all the way around the neckline edge. Take your scissors and trim the work like we've done for the rest of the seams. You're going to want to be trimming the seam allowances where you've sewn the collar onto the neckline, as well as the seam allowance belonging to the second side of the separated collar band. Trim as required. You can also work to trim around the outside edge of the collar and the front edge and lapel of the garment, because we're going to work to do some hand sewing shortly. When it comes to hand sewing, you can work to hand sew the layers together around the outside edge of the collar. Like with lots of other seams that we've done, you're just going to want to tuck the two seam allowances in towards the middle of the separated seam allowance and hand stitch them together using a ladder stitch. When you get to a corner, I recommend that you complete the same technique that we've discussed previously, where you fold in the two edges in an opposite manner. On one side, I will fold under outside edge of the collar and then the angle of the collar. For the other side, I will fold under the angle of the collar and then the outside edge of the collar. Add some extra stitches as you work around the corner if needed. Continue hand sewing along the short edge of the collar, stopping about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch away from the join between the collar and the neckline of the garment. You can tie off and secure your collar stitching here, because it's usually easiest to finish this area of the join between the collar and the neck seam by continuing the neck seam hand sewing. In order for us to neatly finish the connection between the collar and the garment, we're going to need to cut into the seam allowances belonging to the lapel. Using a sharp pair of scissors or snips, you need to cut at a right angle to the stitching, joining the collar to the neckline. The cut should align with the end of the stitching and should cut to but not through the stitching, stopping approximately 2 to 3 millimeters away, a generous 1/16 of an inch. This cut will allow you to finish the top edge of the lapel differently to how the collar along the neck edge will be finished. If you haven't already, you're going to want to trim the seam allowances belonging to the top edge of the lapel as well as the front edge of the lapel and garment. Trim them, removing the same amount that you've used on the other seams. We're going to be tucking the seam allowances into the middle along the front edge, up the length of the lapel and along the top edge of the lapel, completing our ladder stitch. You will sew the corner of the lapel using the same method that we completed for the corner of the collar. And you will be able to sew this all the way up to that snip, with the seam allowances being tucked in towards the middle before the cut, and after the cut the seam allowances will be going towards the collar band and will be finished neatly by the hand stitching at the neckline edge. The neckline edge will be finished by the hand sewn slip stitch like you've completed for many other seams in this garment. You're going to want to work all the way around to the end of the collar. When you get to where the collar stops being joined to the neck, you will then need to ladder stitch along the edge of the collar, fastening any areas that were previously left open. Secure your stitching and complete the same technique for the second side. The final element that you're going to need to complete for your garment is the belt. You may or may not have a centre back seam in your belt, depending on the width of your fabric. If you have a centre back seam, you're going to want to sew it like you've completed for many other seams in this garment. If you have a one-piece belt, you're going to want to complete a basting stitch all the way around, separate the material up to the basting stitch, and then complete a guide stitch on both layers of the separated seam allowance on all 4 sides. If your belt has a centre back seam, then the only difference in these instructions is that the left-hand side of the belt needs to have the basting stitch complete, the 2 layers of material separated up to the basting stitch, and a guide stitch completed on what will be the wrong side of the separated seam allowance. The right-hand side of the centre back seam does not need to have the basting stitch completed. Position the belts together, aligning them along the centre back seam. You'll be matching the right and the left belt together with the right sides of the material against one another. You will be sewing through the entire layer of the right belt and through the left belt top separated seam allowance. You need to start and stop sewing in line with the basting stitch. This is the same technique that we've used in other areas of the garment, because you will need to be finishing the long edge of the belt on either side of this seam. Sew this at the sewing machine using your seam allowance. On completion, you will press your seam allowances and trim them. You can then work to hand sew this seam of the belt using a slip stitch. You will be hand sewing between the basting stitch. The separated seam allowances on either end can also be hand sewn separately, like we did for other areas of the garment. Once complete, you will then work to firstly trim and then hand sew with a ladder stitch all the way around the outside of the belt, using the same techniques that we've discussed throughout this whole project. And here you have the finished belt, hand sewn all the way around. The final thing that we are going to add to this garment are some belt loops. To create your belt loops, you're going to need to take your cutout pattern piece and you're going to want to separate the two layers of material right down the middle. This is to reduce the thickness. On one side of the belt loop, the side that's going to be on the inside, you're going to want to complete a guide stitch 1/4 inch, 5mm away from the short edge on either end. Then you can place the belt loops with the right sides together. At the sewing machine, you're going to be sewing along both of the long edges, following your seam allowance, 1/4 inch or 5mm. However, you don't want to start and stop sewing right at the edge of this. We're going to start that 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch back from the short edge, as marked on the pattern. This will help us fix the belt loop onto the garment without creating excess bulk. Once you've sewn both sides of the long edges of the belt loop, you can then trim your seam allowances if required and turn the belt loop around to the right side. Press the belt loop flat with the iron, keeping the seams on both of the side edges. Ensure that the belt loop is the same width throughout the area that's been sewn, as well as the 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch that is not sewn at the two ends. You may need to press these areas separately. Once you're happy with your belt loop and you have two symmetrical belt loops, you're then going to want to attach them onto the coat. I have already gone ahead and attached one belt loop. I need to make sure that I apply both belt loops symmetrically onto the garment. So I will measure down from my underarm to the sewn seam of the belt loop, ensuring the notch markings on the garment are in the same place. It doesn't matter if you attach the top or the bottom of the belt loop first. On this side, I'm working with the top. Position the belt loop so that you have your seam allowance. Mine is 5mm or 1/4 inch. I will be sewing in line with my pin. I decided to position my belt loops abutting the side seam on the back of the garment rather than on top of the side seam, as this would create more bulk in that area. You're only going to be attaching the one layer of the belt loop to the jacket at this point. It can be a good idea to baste or tack the belt loop in place prior to taking it to the sewing machine. Once you're happy, we will take this to the sewing machine and you will sew over the belt loop, following your seam allowance from the raw short edge of the belt loop. Mine is 1/4 inch, 5mm. You want to be as neat as possible here with your sewing because you will see this stitching on the inside of the garment. Sew across the width of the belt loop. Backstitch for a couple of stitches at the start and the end. Trim the seam allowance across the short edge of the belt loop and remove any tacking stitches. Next, you're going to want to work to hand sew the belt loop together. The two separated edges where you stopped sewing that 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch from the short edge of the belt loop now need to be attached together. Use your ladder stitch to sew the long edges together, then work across the short edges. Once you've completed the hand sewing, and it looks something like this, you're then going to be able to attach the other side of the belt loop. Take the outside of the belt loop and apply this to what is the right side of the garment, aligning the belt loop with the marker for your belt loop placement. The belt loop should be aligned on the back of the garment to one side of the side seam like it was for the other side of the belt loop. It's always a good idea to measure your belt loops to check that they're symmetrical. This second side can be a little bit tricky to pin and sew. I would recommend hand sewing or tacking this on first to make it easier to sew at the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, you are going to sew this second side of the belt loop in the same way that you completed the first side. It's simply a little bit trickier because you've already got one side attached. I usually hold the rest of the belt loop out of the way so that it's flat whilst I'm sewing across this. Once the second side of the belt loop has been sewn onto the coat, you're then going to want to hand sew this in the same manner that you completed the first side. Now we have the belt loop attached and hand sewn on both sides. The final step is to fold the belt loop back on both sides and sew across the belt loop again, approximately 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, away from the short edge of the belt loop. Again, you're going to want to check that both belt loops are symmetrical. At the sewing machine, you're simply going to be holding the belt loop out of the way so that you can sew across it, and you'll do that on both sides of the belt loop. To finish, you're going to want to give the belt loop a nice flat press. You can use something like a clapper or a piece of hardwood to support this. Position the belt into both belt loops And there you have it, the finished belt loops on the back of your coat. The next step with your garment is to work to remove the basting stitches. Simply use an unpicker, a small pair of scissors or a pair of snips and delicately remove them from the garment. Before you remove your roll line markings, it can be a nice idea to steam the roll line in place. Fold up a towel and position this on the right side of the garment front, aligning with the roll line. Fold the lapel on the roll line over the towel. Steam in position. Leave to cool before removing the towel. Remove any remaining basting or tacking stitches. Mine are down the roll line and the centre front of the garment. And there you have it, your finished sewn coat with the finished collar and lapel. Thanks for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this class and the 3-part series and learned some new techniques. I hope to see you in the next one.